Okay, today we're going to talk about the faith of the king. Let's turn to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel. Now we've been talking about David. I love to teach on David. There's so much in the scripture about him, of course. And we've looked at the fact that the beginning of his house that actually began with Ruth and Boaz. And then, of course, we looked at him as a warrior when he fought Goliath. We looked at him as the shepherd because that's when he wrote the Psalms and was out learning how to be really a king as he was learning how to be a shepherd. And then we talked about his troubles because you remember that there was another king first by the name of Saul who was not a good king. And worse than that, he was after David to try to kill him. And so David's reign, by the time he really gets on the throne, is 40 years. 40 years. There's a lot of 40 in the scripture. 40 is a generation. Sometimes we think of it as a generation. But it's a good time. Lots of times it's considered a time of testing. Because, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years Jesus was tempted, 40 days, I mean. But his reign covered 40 years. Now, you remember that for a long period of time, he was anointed king. You remember even before he went to fight Goliath, just as a teenager. And so there was a long period of time, probably a good 10 years, that he ran from Saul. Saul tried to kill him. And then we remember last week we talked about the very end of the lesson that Saul and Jonathan, his son, who truly loved David and they had a wonderful, wonderful brotherly relationship, were killed in battle. Actually, Saul committed suicide. And so Saul is dead. Now David is about 30 years old, and he now realizes it's time for him to reign. So when we look at the beginning of his reign, we find that it really begins with triumph in many ways. We're going to see how he pulls the nation together. When in the first part of the second book of Samuel, where we are right now, there's a messenger that comes from the battlefield to David to tell him that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And he thinks he's bringing great news, because he knows that David has been pursued for years by Saul. Everyone pretty well knows that. And so he thinks, well, David's going to be really excited to get this news that Saul's finally dead and he can now take the throne. Well, you find in this first chapter that David is very upset. He's very upset. He has always considered Saul God's anointed. Remember, we discussed that last week, how he had opportunity to kill Saul and he wouldn't do it. He said, he's God's anointed. I will not touch God's anointed. That's a message for us. Sometimes we don't always agree with somebody that God has anointed, and we think we know better, and we would like to get rid of them, or whatever we might decide to do. I've always been very cognizant of the fact that who sometimes God anoints strange people, and they may not be to our liking, and they may not fit into our program and plan, but we better leave it alone and leave it to God. And so we find in the first chapter here of Samuel that David is very upset. He mourns Saul's death, and of course Jonathan's death, and puts to death the messenger. He said, you thought you were bringing me good news, and this is, you brought it out of pride and maybe trying to gain a position or whatever, and he puts him to death. So it's interesting. He really, that's how his reign starts in many ways. Now let's go over to chapter 2, verse 1. It says, after this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Now, you have to remember that David is down among the Philistines. Remember, that's where he's been living. And remember last week we talked about how he was in Ziklag, which is down near the Philistines. Actually, the Philistines lived along what is today pretty much the Gaza Strip. And so if you kind of get a picture, think in your mind of what Israel looks like, the Gaza Strip along the Mediterranean Sea was primarily where the Philistines lived. So David inquires of God. That's the first thing he does. He doesn't just say, well, now I'm king, I'll go and do what I want to do. He says, okay, God, now what'll I do? If I'm going to be king, he knows, of course, he's from the tribe of Judah. So his tribe will probably rally around him. And so he's saying, that's why he said to God, shall I go to one of the cities of Judah? Is this where I should begin? And God says, yes, you go to Hebron. Now, where's Hebron? Hebron's south of Jerusalem, quite a little bit. It's in the southern part of Israel. And if you remember now, get your memory going way back to the book of Genesis, when Sarah died, Abraham's wife, Abraham went and purchased a plot of land in what became known as Hebron. And that's where he buried Sarah. And then later on, he was buried there. And then Isaac and Rebekah were buried there. And Jacob and Leah were buried there. It's called the Tomb of the Patriarchs to this day. And Hebron, of course, is still a city in Israel, isn't it? And it's today, I'm sorry to say, in the West Bank, and is much fought over. I've been there once, maybe I was there twice, but no longer can you go there because it's in disputed territory where it's not really terribly safe. But it was the city where God instructed David to go and set up his throne. And so we see in verse 4, go to verse 4, it says, and the men of Judah came, and there they anointed King David over the house of Judah. So he begins his reign in Hebron. And he stays there for 7 years. 7 years. And he basically is ruling over his own tribe, over the tribe of Judah. And they gather around him and so forth. Now, we're going to get into some interesting things. We're not going to take a whole lot of time to cover, and I'll kind of just tell you the story. Saul, when he was king, had a general of his army was called Abner. And so Abner, you know, thinks now he's the big cheese. I mean, Saul's gone, Jonathan's gone. Remember, Jonathan was Saul's oldest son and would have been in line to be king. We talked about that last week. And yet Jonathan recognized that David was to be the king. And so Abner, thinking he's the big guy now, decides to put in one of Saul's sons. Now, it's customary, it was customary, I should say, at that time, that when a new king comes onto the throne, particularly if they were from a different tribe or a different nationality, that they would kill off all the family of the previous king in order that there not be any kind of insurrection come and try to grab the throne. I mean, that's gone on for centuries. You read medieval history and all of that, and there's, kings killing sons and, and marrying and, whatnot. I mean, when I study history, you start to figure out all the houses of this and that got together because of marriage. It's really a big mess, isn't it? And nobody seemed to follow God like they should have. But anyway, so Abner sets up one of Saul's sons as king. And he reigns then pretty much over the other tribes of Israel. Now remember, there's 12 of them altogether. So the other tribes are pretty much under Saul's son for a couple of years. And if you're going to go in Saul's line, the true son should have been Jonathan's son, who was a man by the name of Mephibosheth. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. But right now, when we're in chapter 2, and I'm just telling you the story pretty much, there's a quarrel between Abner, who was Saul's general, and Joab, who is David's general. Okay, so now we got the military involved, and of course they have generals, and so now they're going to fuss with each other. Well, in the end, Joab, who is David's general, kills Abner. So we have now pretty much Saul's lineage is beginning to just deteriorate and go away. All right, let's go over to chapter 4. We get that all taken care of pretty much. Let's go over to chapter 4. And we find that when Abner died, Saul's house is in just total disarray. And they flee now. I mean, a lot of them just run and flee. And the king then was sabotaged and killed in his bed. They put another man in, and then they had some other men rise up, and they stabbed him in his bed and beheaded him. And I mean, it's just a bloody, bloody time. You know, I mean, we think about, you know, God set it in order, and yet when people don't follow God, and they're going to come in and try to, you know, put it together themselves, it's going to be a bloody mess. And that's kind of what happens here. So David commanded that these men who did the sabotaging be killed. See, David was really protective in many ways of Saul's household. He said, you know, this is not the right way to do it. And because they were committing murder. You know, the Ten Commandments say, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. And so when somebody goes in and literally sabotages and kills somebody, that's murder. And so David uses capital punishment, which is biblical, and says, well, they have to be killed. All right, now let's go over to 1 Samuel 5. We did all of that quickly. Okay, 1 Samuel 5. And I'm going to read verse 1. 2 Samuel, I'm sorry. 2 Samuel 5, verse 1. Now don't leave this book. If I say the wrong thing, they stay right here. Okay. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. Now notice, all the tribes, finally, they're tired, I think, of all of this diddle going on with Saul's sons and generals and all of this. So they finally decide themselves to come under David. So it says, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you that led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Okay, finally, chapter 5, David becomes the king over all of Israel, and all 12 tribes come under him. David was, of course, the king. I mean, you go to Jerusalem today and you can see the tomb of David. It's one of the biggest tombs I've ever seen. I mean, it's huge. You'd think there's a giant buried in there. And they just make, it's a big deal. And you can go in and see where he is. The tomb is pretty close to the upper room. So when you're visiting the upper room, then you come down, and I always think it's interesting. You see David's tomb, and then you remember on when Peter preached on Pentecost, he talked about how David died and his tomb is with us. Well, if he was in the upper room, it's just practically next door. So if that's the correct place where it all was, that's just kind of interesting. But anyway, David now becomes king. Let's go to verse 6. Verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David cannot come in here. Now, let's think for a moment. They're down in Hebron. Hebron, we said, was in the southern part of Israel, down pretty much straight, it would be straight west of the Dead Sea, down near Masada in that area. Okay, so they decide to go up to Jerusalem, the king does, and take that from the Jebusites. Now, it was sometimes called Jebus. Jerusalem had been called that. However, you could go clear back to the book of Genesis and find out, you remember, that Melchizedek was the priest of Salem, which was another name for what became known as Jerusalem. So David evidently feels led of the Lord to go up to take this area. And he goes up there, and it's a stronghold of the Jebusites, and they make this claim, David will never take us. We're solid. We've got the fortress, and he will never take us. Now look at verse 7. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Now I want you to see the names here. Jerusalem, the city of David, Zion. Zion's another name for Jerusalem. We just said it could be called Salem. It had been called Salem much earlier. It had even been called Jebus under the Jebusites. But it was a stronghold, like a fortress. Okay? The city of David. How many of you have been to Israel? Let me see your hands. Okay. The city, if you've been to Israel, you have been to the Western Wall. And when you come out of the western wall through the Dung Gate, which is the southern part of that area, and you go across the road and you look down, kind of over the fence, there's a big, big area, kind of an oval-shaped area, that is the city of David. That's the old city of David. Now, they just recently, within the last 10 years, have really been doing a lot of excavating there. Have you been down in that area?
Yeah,
Kitty?
it's amazing.
And that's, of course, down in the lower part of that is where the Pool of Siloam is. We've been there, Jean. Some of us have been there. But it's basically has been for a good many years pretty much an Arab neighborhood. But the old city of Jerusalem was called the City of David, and it was that little area down below. Now, I've got a picture on your table. You want to look at it. It looks like this. And you will see that there is a palace up on top here. This is the shape. This is the City of David, as we're looking at it here. And it's shaped like this. Now, this is the beginning of what today we know as Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem is huge now. I mean, it's over 500,000 people. But that's how it started. That was Jerusalem. This is what David took. This was the fortress. This was the stronghold that they said he couldn't take. And yet he took it. Okay, now we're going to go on here. The country now is united, and Zion becomes the capital here. Now David seeks the Lord about what he's supposed to do. How is he supposed to subdue the Philistines? Because they are an enemy. They have been for a long, long time. Go down to verse 23. Verse 23. It says, when David inquired of the Lord, now I think it's so interesting that he's checking with the Lord on everything, isn't he? Now he's saying, okay, now God, what do I do? He went up and he took the city of Jerusalem. He's made that now the capital. He's going to, and we're going to talk with you in a moment about how he built his home there and all that. And now he's going to take little by little the land. So verse 23 says, when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Now, this is what the Lord said. Go around to their rear and come upon them opposite the balsam trees. Now, if you're reading King James, it says the mulberry trees. I always kind of like that version because we had mulberry trees on our farm. And mulberries are really good. They're really good. They're kind of like raspberries, only they're not as raspy, and they're real sweet. We used to just eat them right off the tree. Okay, verse 24. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then bestir yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to smite the army of the Philistines. Now, he's saying, go around in the back and wait. And when you hear the sound of the army of the Lord, who would that be? In the treetops. The angels. When you hear the sound of the angels of the Lord in the tops of the trees, then you move. Well, boy, if the angels of God are with him, they can't lose, can they? And then it says, verse 25, and David did as the Lord commanded him and smote the Philistines from Geba to Gezer, which is, of course, like I said, all pretty much of the Gaza Strip. So David really, really is listening to God, and God is showing him how to take the enemies, how to unite the country, because we've had all these 12 tribes, you know, and they've been at odds with one another. And so he's getting the country now put back together. So the first thing David wants to do is to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, to the capital. Now, if you look at your picture again, you will find that up here at the top, see, it kind of goes down. There's a valley on either side here, and up here at the top is a palace. Now that's David's palace. And right beside it, you will see a little tent. You see that little tent right there? Right there is a little tent. And David knows that the Ark of the Covenant belongs in the tent of God, which was the tabernacle, of course. And so he makes this little tent, he sets that tent up there, and he says, I want to bring the Ark of the Covenant back and put it in the tent. And he puts it right outside his palace so that he can go and meet with God there. And so that's his plan. Now let me talk with you just a little bit about the Ark of the Tabernacle. You remember when they came into Israel, the children of Israel from the wilderness, they had, of course, the tabernacle, and they set it up at a place called Shiloh. which is kind of in the middle of Israel. And we talked about this, I think last week or the week before, that at one point the army decided to take the Ark of the Covenant into battle, which God had never said to do. The Ark of the Covenant was the place, the chest, that was made of acacia wood, you remember, covered with gold. It represented Jesus, really. And inside it were the Ten Commandments, the law. It was the place where God dwelled. Remember, on top of it was the mercy seat with the cherubim that looked down upon the seat. And, you know, this is where the pillar of cloud came down, the pillar of fire. God dwelt there, and it was to remain in that tent. But they decided it would be like a good luck piece. They made like a talisman out of it. And they took it into battle, and of course it was captured by the Philistines. Well, they took it into somebody's house, and that house was just so blessed, and all the pagan idols they had in the house just fell down off their shelves, and because the presence of God was there, so anything that's idolatrous is going to fall, right? And so, you know, and there it sat. And of course everybody didn't know how in the world to get it back. So David decides that he is going to go and get this. Now, if you want to read about when all that happened, that's in 1 Samuel 4. We talked about that before. All right, let's go on here now. We're in, where are we? 1 Samuel 6, verse 3. 1 Samuel 6, verse 3. So, they get together here. It says they carried the Ark of the God. They went and they got it, and they put it upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the Ark of God, and Ahio went before the Ark. And David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the Ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. You know, they stumbled, so it looked like the ark was going to fall off the cart. So he puts his hand up to steady it. Verse 7, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and the Lord smote him there because he put forth his hand to the ark. And he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken forth upon Uzzah. Okay. The whole problem is they did this all wrong. David didn't read the instruction book. Have you ever tried to fix something without reading the instruction book? And you got into a big mess? See, if in doubt, go back and read the instructions, I always say. Well, David did not read Numbers 4. Now keep your finger here and let's go back to Numbers 4. Numbers 4 is where God is giving them some of the instructions about the tabernacle. And of course, he gave them explicit instructions about how to build it. That's all in our teaching on the tabernacle. But he also gave them instruction about how to carry it, because they would have to, of course, take the tabernacle down in the wilderness, and they had to move it periodically and carry it around. And so in chapter 4, Numbers 4, verse 15, Numbers 15, it's talking about when they move now, when they take the tabernacle apart and they move. It says, and when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, in other words, the Ark of the Covenant was not even to be seen. The priests had to go in and take the curtain down. Remember, there was a curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And they took that curtain down and